reading portion of today's lesson, where I will read the reading that I've assigned to you guys, and I'll break it down paragraph by paragraph, and then I'll walk you guys through the first two questions that come after the reading, so you guys get an idea of how I want you guys to break down the questions and break down the text. So let's get started. The end of the Civil War. In early 1865, the Union Army began marching through the state of Virginia, pushing back the Confederate forces. In hopes of uniting with more Confederate troops in North Carolina, General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army abandoned the capital of Richmond and retreated. However, the Union Army soon cut off their retreat, and they were forced to stop at Appomattox, Virginia. General Grant and the Union Army had the Confederates surrounded. The Confederates were low on supplies. Many soldiers were deserting or running from their job, and they were greatly outnumbered. Upon looking at the conditions and the odds, General Lee felt he had no choice but to surrender. The terms of the surrender were generous. Confederate soldiers would have to turn in their rifles, but they could return home immediately and keep their horses or mules. They were also given food, as many of them were very hungry. All right, so before we keep reading, let's break down these two paragraphs. Let's start with this paragraph right here. And some important things I think are relevant in mentioning is that we see here in the second sentence, in hopes of uniting with more Confederate troops in North Carolina, General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army, blah, blah, blah. What I want to identify as important is a connection. So the connection between General Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy. So here I'm going to make a note. Robert E. Lee equals what? A Confederate or a Union general. So based on what we just read, it seems like he's a Confederate general, because it says it twice in this sentence, the second sentence. In hopes of uniting with more Confederate troops in North Carolina, General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. So that's how we know that Robert E. Lee is a Confederate. And remember, if you guys are having trouble remembering, the Confederates or the Confederacy is the South. These are the states that left the Union. So put General, because that's his title. Okay, General Robert E. Lee. Cool. But then something happened. This guy, he was on the way to Virginia, and then he was stopped by the Union Army. So let's see what happens after. That's in this paragraph. So let's pick out what's most important. General Grant and the Union Army had the Confederates surrounded. So right off the bat, we have another connection we need to make. So if General Robert E. Lee is with the Confederacy, then General Grant has to be with the Union. So we'll put General Grant. Now the reading doesn't say this, but his full name is Ulysses S. Grant. So General Grant, and what team is he on again? He's got to be on the Union side, okay? So this guy stops this guy from reaching Virginia and linking up with more of his people. So what does that result in? That results in the people that are with General Robert E. Lee, the soldiers with him, they're freaking out because they're seeing that they can't win against General Grant, and they're seeing that defeat or losing is imminent or like coming soon, okay? And so what General Grant does, he says, hey, you guys know what's up. You guys know you would lose if we were to fight, so here's what's going to happen. General Grant says, give me your guns, and we'll give you food, and we'll let you keep your horses, and you guys can be on your way back home. We're keeping your guns. You guys are done. And so that's exactly what happens. General Grant makes this agreement with General Lee, and just like the second paragraph says, the terms of the surrender were generous, meaning they were more than enough. Confederate soldiers turn in their rifles and go home immediately. All right, let me clear the board. And get ready for some annotations for our last three paragraphs. There were many more soldiers and armies throughout the South that had not yet surrendered. However, when they heard of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, many of them knew the war was over. General Joseph Johnston surrendered his army to General Sherman on April 26, 1865. Many other officers followed in surrendering. The last Confederate general to surrender was General Stand Watie, who surrendered on June 23, 1865. On May 5, 1865, Confederate President Jefferson Davis held the last meeting of his cabinet. They officially dissolved or ended the Confederate government. Davis tried to escape but was soon captured. He spent the next 2 years in prison. On August 20th, 1866, President Andrew Johnson signed a document stating that the American Civil War was over and that all of America was at peace. All right, let's break this first paragraph down here. I'm going to put it up a little higher just so that we have room for the other two. Cool. So for this paragraph that I'm filling in, let's make some notes. Okay. So here are some more connections that we're making between people and the teams that they're on. So let's write Confederate generals. And then we've already talked about one. This is Robert E. Lee. But then when we read these last three paragraphs, we were introduced to two more Confederate generals. So let's see if we can find out who they were. Now, this third sentence here in the first paragraph says General Joseph Johnston surrendered his army to General Sherman on April 26. Now, even though it doesn't say whether one or the other was a Confederate or a Union general, let's look at the words being used. General Joseph Johnston surrendered his army. So you only surrender something if you're giving up or if you know that you're losing. Since we know that the end of the war has the Confederates losing, we can make the assumption that General Joseph Johnston was a Confederate general. Why? Because he had to surrender his army, and if you're surrendering something, you're losing. So we have Joseph John, that's an H, sorry, Johnston, okay? And then the last Confederate general was pretty clearly stated at the last sentence of that first paragraph. Many other officers, not that one. The last Confederate general to surrender was General Stand Watie, who surrendered on June 23rd. Pretty straightforward. I'm not sure how to pronounce this guy's last name, Watie, but that's okay. All right, let's break down the second to last paragraph. Right here. Okay, on May 5th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, so we know that the Confederate President, remember, the Confederacy thought of themselves as their own country, separate from the United States, so they had created their own president, right? So the Confederate president was Jefferson Davis, okay? He held the last meeting in his cabinet, and in this last meeting, they decided to end the Confederate government. So, Confederate President Jefferson Davis, he ends his side in a meeting with his people. Cool. All right, and let's see this last paragraph. This is my crappily drawn arrow. Cool. Last paragraph. On August 20th, President Andrew Johnson signed a document that's stating that the American Civil War was over and all of America was at peace. So we just read about a Confederate president, which means that in this next paragraph, when a different president is mentioned, we can only assume that that is the true United States president that comes after Lincoln. Because remember, Lincoln started the Civil War, or he was the president when the Civil War started, and he died before it ended. So that means someone else had to take his place. Someone else saw the end of the Civil War. That person was President Andrew Johnson. And I put his last name in all caps because there's another president with a really similar last name, but is it important to know that they are very different people? President Andrew Johnson is not the same, or Johnson, excuse me, is not the same as Andrew Jackson. Completely different. All right, let's take a look at some of these questions. All right, what was the capital? A capital is where the government lives. Where was the capital of the Confederate States of America? So I kind of remember reading that in the first slide. So let's go back to the first slide. Let me clear the board. Okay. Change my pen color. Okay. Excellent. Okay, it says it right here, clear as day in the first paragraph. I'll read from the very beginning of the paragraph, just so as I'm reading, you guys try and see if you can pick it out with your ears. In early 1865, the Union Army began marching through the state of Virginia, pushing back the Confederate forces in hopes of reuniting with more Confederate troops of North Carolina. General Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army abandoned the capital of Richmond and retreated. However, the Union Army cut off the retreat and they were forced to stop at Appomattox, Virginia. So Richmond, it sounds like, well, according to the text, it is the capital. So Richmond equals the capital of the Confederacy. Now, Richmond is a city. Now we need to figure out the state. So let's try and figure that out. Well, in the first sentence, it says that they're already marching through Virginia. They're trying to come from Virginia to North Carolina. So if you think about a map, let's say this is Virginia. Yep, and this is North Carolina. So they're trying to go from here, somewhere in Virginia, on down to NC, right? And they're going to have to cross the capital, the abandoned capital of Richmond. So that means they haven't gotten to North Carolina yet, which leads me to believe that Richmond is a city in Virginia. Please feel free to Slack or Google Hangouts me if my explanation of that didn't make sense or if something that I've done so far needs more clarity. All right, let's look at one more question. Let me just clear the board here and bring back my old notes. Cool. Okay. Let me go back here. So the question, what was the capital? We decided that it was A, Richmond, Virginia. Okay, check all the names of the Confederate generals that the reading mentions. Since we made these annotations and these kind of notes on the side of our reading, we don't have to really look for it. We made a list of the Confederate generals right here. So we have Robert E. Lee, Joseph Johnston, and Stand Watie. And I see all three of those options in the answers provided. Now, this one was level 2 difficulty of figuring out. This one at the bottom was level 1. This was level 3, Joseph Johnston. The reason figuring out this one was tough is because the reading didn't directly tell you that he was a Confederate soldier. For this one, you had to make an inference. Make an inference. And that's something you'll have to be doing pretty often, not just in this reading, but in any reading for any class ever. You'll be having to make inferences all the time. But make sure that you can back up those inferences with an explanation, either that you create for yourself or with evidence from the text. All right, guys, the same way that I tackled this problem and that problem and made annotations for our reading, either by writing or, I didn't do it this time, but drawing as well. Use those annotations and those understandings and my way of breaking things down to help you answer the questions that are coming up after those two, and even the questions that come in the independent practice. Now, I made a note of this in the actual assignment, but please, please, please do not mark anything is IDK. That is really frustrating, not just to me, but Mr. Campbell, Miss Powell, and Miss Thomas as well. We want to hear what you guys are thinking. If you are not sure about something, get into contact with us. IDK will no longer be accepted as an answer starting next week, just to give you guys a heads up. All right. That was our guided practice for today. Thank you guys so much. Love you all a ton. I know I've been kind of flaky with the video Zoom meetings every Tuesday. I'm going to try 100% my hardest this Thursday, tomorrow, to get on there. I haven't seen you guys in such a long time. My bad. All right, guys. Love you guys lots. Good luck on the rest of the lesson. And remember to communicate with me if you have any issues. All right. Peace.